Hello again. This is social science, and I believe it is section 4. And we are discussing today the end of the Cold War. Now, I haven't really prepared a slideshow, so please cut me some slack on that. The Cold War had essentially been in a stalemate for several years by the time of its demise, since the institution of more America-friendly ideals in Russian government were implemented, and we had JFK for many years before, his famous assassination. And he was much more Russia friendly than most other presidents. The area of highest tension was Germany and Berlin due to the split of the city after World War II by the infamous Berlin Wall. I'm just going to switch to this slide so it looks like I prepared something. The U.S. presidential elections soon brought with them a widening of these tensions with anti-Soviet President Ronald Reagan, who had run under a largely grassroots campaign with the promise of restoring traditional American values. Now, he had called the Soviet Union an evil empire openly, and this was not a good thing for international relations, at least if, you support a peaceful resolution of the Cold War. And this was only in the early stages of his presidency. But yeah, he spoke openly about an evil empire at an address in Orlando, and he seemed to believe that the USSR was morally wrong and repugnant in all of its ways, and the US was simply doing its duty with all Cold War efforts. As such, Reagan increased spending on the military by more than $100 billion. Crazy. You've heard of the Star Wars missile defense system. That is part of that budget boost, I guess. Um, Produced under the newly formed Strategic Defense Initiative. The U.S. was obviously preparing for a nuclear strike, and this worried officials in Moscow. The USA, with enhanced nuclear defense capacities would have a major advantage over the USSR in the event of war, and so a new arms race was begun. Within the Reagan administration, with heavy backing from Gene Kirkpatrick, the UN representative for the US, a foreign policy of backing anti-communist leadership in third world countries or satellite states, regardless of political structure or respect for human rights. Although the U.S. gets a lot of criticism for this phase of policy, it must be noted the USSR pursued much the same ideals, if not more, to a greater extent. Um, the Central America of the Cold War was divided. Many nations were undergoing communist revolutions as the nations of Cuba and Russia exerted their influence. The first Central American nation to be taken over in such a revolution was Nicaragua in 1979. The U.S. hated the loss of this trading partner and backed counter-revolutionaries, or Contras, in an attempt to overthrow the new leadership while strengthening nearby anti-communist El Salvador, which ruthlessly murdered innocents in an attempt to strengthen the Salvadorian military dictatorship against insurgency. Support for the Contras and similar groups by the executive branch led to a growing concern in the U.S. Congress, which eventually passed legislature to bar all funds and aid to such groups in Nicaragua, citing the abuse of citizens and crime waves found to be connected with the Contras. In what can today be considered a textbook presidential scandal, happens more than I think we realize. Um, President Reagan went behind Congress's back and ordered the placement of explosives around Contra territory to detonate on cargo ships suspected of channeling arms to the communist government. Now, to be clear, these weren't civilian cargo ships, so, not 100%. These were more merchant marines. wasn't, attacking civilians. The contractors were supporting them. High-level arrests in the intelligence and military communities would later be made because of this abuse of power, but Reagan avoided charges. The American voter was not satisfied without a solid U.S. military victory. Reagan's advisors could see the writing on the wall. When an opportunity for intervention in another state arose in the small island of Grenada with the coming of a communist takeover, we leapt at it. The country had already been communist, but this coup essentially had established it as a sovereign nation from Cuba, meaning Cuba wouldn't be able to provide cover fire for them anymore. The stated reason for Operation Urgent Fury, as the attack by U.S. forces on the island was called, was to, sorry, I'm reading off my notes here, secure U.S. citizens on the island and, of course, to overthrow the communists. The invasion was overwhelmingly successful, go figure, and immediately springboarded another one. A number of factors led to the failure, and let's go over the USSR. The USSR is a state. The economy was tanking after overblown military tanking after overblown military spending on unsuccessful ventures in Ukraine. Yeah, the Ukraine war meant a lot of young Soviet men got killed, and because it was a largely industrial society, that was the backbone of their workforce. So their workforce was very small and depleted. Uh, they had to import grain. Um, yeah, a lot of factors. The Soviet economy dealt in steel manufacturing, which I believe the packet said was more suited to a, post pre or industrial revolution society than a information revolution or whatever it's called society. People were demanding more computers and, parts for those and things like that and consumer goods. They weren't really buying steel in bulk anymore, which was the main Soviet export. These were, of course, steel's, of course, manufacturable in any country. It's one of the, although it's not, a simple resource, one of the easiest to make because, we've been doing it so long. So pretty much every decently sized country would be able to produce its own steel. And the USSR was definitely suffering for it. And they were also selling heavy timber, again, manufacturable in almost every country. Yeah, it was much more, yeah. So because grain had to be imported, food shortages plagued everything, and that's, famous. There's a wide variety of jokes about that sort of stuff. Yeah, I can't think of one. Dang it. Um, yeah, and the leadership of the USSR was very old, and a lot of them were dying, much like our leadership today. The old guard mostly passed away. The Berlin Wall fell, and the USSR simply could no longer hold itself together, to summarize. But yeah, because the leadership was so old, they asked a man named Gorbachev to replace the old Soviet secretary, and Gorbachev was what I think at least 2 times younger than most of the Soviet leadership, and he turned out to have a very accepting foreign policy as compared to most other Soviet secretaries. And what he did was open up kind of, he didn't completely make his nation capitalist, but he opened it up to some capitalist ideals. And eventually that led to the disbanding of the USSR, that among the other factors, and the building of a McDonald's in Russia. The grand end of the Cold War. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. Um, Enjoy the rest of your day.